So Proverbs chapter 22, we're going to start here in verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver or gold. And this is a concept, a theme that's being repeated throughout the book of Proverbs. And the idea here is the idea that having a good name is better than all the gold or the riches, large bank accounts in the world. The only honor that really is safe is the honor that comes from God. Not the fleeting honor of somebody giving you an award or a prize. You've seen it with sports teams and so forth where they win the Super Bowl or some national championship, and then what do they do after that? Pursue another one, because it's not lasting. But when you have honor before the Lord, it is lasting. Verse 2, the rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is maker of them all. What a fabulous comment and a thought. That whether somebody is what we might call filthy rich, or we might call them dirt poor, God is the maker of all. And so we should have a compassion, understanding that just because somebody's wealthy doesn't make them better in God's eyes, or because they're poor that they're somehow of less value. But we ought to have a compassion for them, a concern for those that are less fortunate. We should treat every person with dignity and respect because God is their creator, irregardless of what part of the world they live in, irregardless of their ethnicity, their language, their education, the amount of money they have or the lack of money. We should treat each person as an individual who's precious in the eyes of God. Verse 3, a prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple pass by and are punished. Now this seems quite obvious, but if you're wise, if you have understanding, or the prudent, you see a potential danger and you avoid it. In other words, you don't walk down the dark alley at night with a $100 bill out of your back pocket. That's not wise. That's not prudent. But yet the simple, or somebody who lacks understanding, continue to do the same sort of things and they suffer the consequences. Verse 4, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Notice the key here is humility and the fear or the respect for the Lord. Remember, we've talked about this fear throughout the book of Proverbs. Fear is really wisdom or an honor or a respect for God. In other words, you're living your life with a mindset, what does God think about this? It's not the fear of, oh no, I'm scared that God's going to crush me like a little bug. But instead what it is an honor, a respect, a conscious effort to what does God view? What does God think about my behavior or even my thought patterns? And wanting to do that. You see, humility is really how you and I triumph in Christ. The world tells us to be proud, to build yourself up, to make sure everybody knows how good you are at this or that. But instead, you and I, as Christians, are to follow the example of Christ. And you may recall again in Philippians where God says that Christ humbled himself to the point of being a bondservant. So humility. Now, humility is not thinking less of yourselves, but humility is recognizing who you really are, that you're Christ dependent, that you can't do things apart from Jesus Christ. Or let's put it this way, you can't do things of eternal value apart from Jesus Christ. So genuine humility results in God exalting you. And it's much better to have God exalt you than us to exalt ourselves or to have some sort of award of some sort that's just temporary. Verse 5, thorns and snares are the way of the perverse, and he who guards his soul will be far from them. Thorns and snares. Maybe you ever walked down a pathway and had bushes catch you or catch on your clothes, rip your clothes, and that sort of thing. This metaphor here refers to the various temptations that we find in life. The temptations for easy money or easy sex. But those who are wise avoid them. The moment, the other day, a week or so ago, some guys I was up at a store, and some guys kind of came around the corner, pulled up in a van, and they rolled down their window and said, "Hey, do you want a home theater system? I got a deal for you." I think I exercised a little bit of wisdom to say, "No, thank you. No, want that." I don't know how hot it was or whatever else, but they were going around the neighborhood offering a home theater system to whoever would give them some money. And so wisdom says, or prudence says, let's avoid that. Let's avoid those things that trap me. Verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now here's an interesting verse, and really kind of the theme where we pick the theme up of raising them right. To train up a child. You see, children need training. They need to be molded or guided along the way. If you are a parent, each of your children need to be trained. If you're a grandparent, your grandkids need to be trained. Now, of course, as a grandparent, you have a slightly different role than the parents. As a grandparent, you get to spoil them and then send them back to mom and dad to take care of them. But the idea is they still need to be trained. The concept that we oftentimes say that they're just an innocent child is just blatantly, biblically false. How many of you ever spent any time teaching a child to lie? How many of you ever spent any time teaching a child to take the toy from another child, to say it's mine? The moment that they can walk, the moment that they can express themselves, everything is about them. And so it takes training to say to them, no, you need to share your toys. No, you need to tell the truth. And so the concept here is that we need to train our children. But notice this, the training is prescribed quite literally for each specific child. In other words, the training isn't the same for every child. Every child is different. The purpose is not trying to make the child just like you, but helping to, and this is the hard part for a parent, is understanding the different strengths, attributes, the weaknesses of each of your children, and then encouraging and training them in those things. If you're a gifted musician and your child isn't, you can't force them, you can try, but it does no good, force them to become a musician. If you're an outgoing person and your child isn't, you can't force them to become an outgoing child. You can try, but it just adds to frustration. So the difficulty as a parent is understanding each of your children, the personalities that God has given them, and then training them to do their best, to avoid their weaknesses, but then to train them to really be used of the Lord. So that literally here in the Hebrew, the literally is to train up according to his or her way. To train up your individual child. Now, of course, when they're 2, it's a lot simpler than when they're 12 or 14 or 16. It gets more complicated the older they get. But the idea, again, is to train them according to their strengths and weaknesses. Maybe they're good at athletics and you weren't, but to train them in those ways. But the idea that each of them would have a love for God and a desire for the Lord. And then when it says here that to train up is the same idea as to dedicate. It's literally the idea of you dedicating your child first and foremost to God. I know as parents, we oftentimes want to protect our children, and that's a natural thing, and it's a God-given thing to want to protect your children. But at the same token, they are fundamentally God's. You've been entrusted with a stewardship to watch over them, to train them, to protect them. But ultimately, your children are God's, and so they need to be dedicated to God first and foremost. And then you get to nurse, to teach, to discipline them. Yes, discipline your children, whether they be male or female. But discipline them as God's child, not out of anger, not out of frustration, but disciplining them just like God disciplines us, that they would grow up in a way that would honor the Lord. And again, God has entrusted those children to you. So raise them. Be an example to them. Your children learn more by how you do things and how you interact with your spouse and how you interact with friends and neighbors than they do in all the textbooks in the world. And so be an example to them. Pray with them. Point them back to Christ in your own personal life. And then the promise is that when they are old, that they will not depart from the ways of the Lord. Now, this is not an ironclad guarantee that every child will never have their difficulties, but much like we saw in that video, where an event happened in his daughter's life that he had no clue about, that devastated her. And then the hardness that she felt and the anger that she felt towards the Lord. And he talked about 5 years. For some of you, maybe it's longer than that, of a child that's wayward. And the frustration and the hurt and the anger that comes with that. But the idea is that you would take care to try to train them in the ways of the Lord, that they may one day come back to the Lord, kind of like the prodigal son. And that's the goal here, is that your child, no matter how old they are, how young they are, that they would follow the Lord and not depart from that. Moving on to verse 7. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender. The rich. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that those who are wealthy get to control the corporations and the things of life they have at ease with. So they are the rulers over the poor. The point here is that we ought to be on guard against indebtedness. That we should, the borrower, it says here, is a servant to the lender. And it's drawn out from the ancient world where if you borrowed money, you typically, to pay it off, you made yourself an indentured servant to whoever you borrowed that money from. And you agreed to work for them for so many years, and that would pay off your debt. But in our society today, we have credit card debt and other kinds of debt that we become slaves to the credit card company, as an example. And so you want to take debt very carefully and understand that there are times that you might want to go on a missions trip, as an example, but you might say, I can't because I've got this payment or this car payment or whatever else it might be. And you and I need to be wise. We live in a society that says, get it now. And credit card companies are always willing to give you more credit. And you need to be careful about that. Be wise with that you don't become enslaved to the credit that you've been extended. Verse 8, he who sows iniquity will reap sorrow, and the rod of his anger will fail. You see, the person's sin, that is his iniquity, are like seeds that are sown out. It's springtime here. It's time to be able to plant seeds and flowers and vegetables and all those sorts of things. But if you sow iniquity, you're going to reap what? Consequences for your sin. Reap sorrow. That's the harvest that you get. But if instead you reap righteousness, or you sow righteousness, then you'll get to reap righteousness. Verse 9. He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Again, this is the idea that you would be concerned for those that have less than you, that you'd be generous with them. You can exercise wisdom. In other words, the guy on the street corner, the gal on the street corner, maybe not give them a wad of cash, but instead you could perhaps give them some water, some of the bread that we have there in the back. You can give them tracts, but you can interact with them in a compassionate way. That you would be generous with what you do have. You have a neighbor or a friend or a family member that's struggling, that you would be generous, that you'd be mindful of their struggles and pray for them. And if you have the ability to help them, you can certainly exercise wisdom. We here at the church, we oftentimes get requests from various people for help. And we always have a basic standard. That is, if you need help, if you're really desperate, because usually they have a really good story. And we ask them, well, hey, we've got a food pantry here. Thank you to all of you who have given food for that. And we say, come in and get some food. Most of the time, they don't want that. They just want the rent paid or the electricity paid, and they don't want to bother with us. But if they'll come in and partake of the food, that they give us a sob story that they're hungry and they don't have anything, then we'll see what we can do in a greater way. But we don't give out cash. If they have a specific bill, that we will pay just that bill, not give them cash, because we want to exercise wisdom. But we also want to be generous with those who have a legitimate need. And so we have to balance the two. Is the need legitimate, or is it just a story to get easy money? And each of us can do that. Maybe you run into a gas station. Somebody says, hey, I need money for gas. What my policy is personally is I'll put gas in your tank. I won't give you $10, but I'll put $20 in your gas tank. That way I know that if they really need gas, they'll have gas, and it won't be used for something else. And so just exercise wisdom, but have a generous heart for those who have a need. Cast out the scoffer, verse 10, and contention will leave. Yes, strife and reproach will cease. The scoffer, somebody who's a critic of everything. No matter what you do, they think it's wrong. No matter how you do it, they think it's wrong. I was this way, especially when I was a teenager with my parents. If my dad said you need to turn right here, I found a way to argue with him that no, you can make left-hand turns all the way around. And technically I might be right, but it was really this heart of being a scoffer and contentious. And so if you leave that or you avoid that person, then the strife, the angst goes significantly down. Verse 11, he who loves purity of heart and his grace on his lips, the king will be his friend. What a wonderful thing. The purity of heart, the individual who has integrity, who deals honestly with others, who's gracious in how they deal with other people, they will be friends of great people. See, the greatest men need and should have and should desire and highly prize people of integrity, the acquaintance, the advice of such persons. Our president needs people of integrity. Our governor needs people of integrity to be their advisors. Your bosses, your supervisors, the president of your company needs people of integrity. And of course, we always hear of those who are corrupt, who don't have integrity, those that take the credit for somebody else's work. But wise people need people of integrity. And what does integrity mean? The person that's willing to tell you when something's really bad. You know, when you got food all over your face, a good friend will come to you and say, you've got food all over your face. And that's what you need. You need a person of integrity. A person who can be gracious towards you. In other words, they can phrase things in a way that's not intended to be harsh, but at the same token, they're a person of integrity and will tell you the truth. Verse 12, the eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, and he overthrows the words of the faithless. See, God causes the distortion of those who tell distortions. God understands what they are, and he wants to show things to be true. So the eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, and he overthrows the words of the foolish ones. Verse 13, the lazy man says, there's a lion outside. I shall be slain in the streets. What a great word picture here. It's the idea, we've seen this lazy man throughout the book of Proverbs. Sometimes he's called a sluggard. But it's a person who will do anything and everything to avoid doing what we today would call a good day's work. And it's not so much about somebody how hard they work physically, but are they diligent with working? And here it is, an excuse. There's a lion, or there might be danger, there might be a lion in the town, so I won't even go out of the house. That's a person who's looking for an excuse not to work. And so you and I as Christians need to not be that type of person. Don't allow obstacles or hard work or difficulties keep you from doing what God's called you to do. Again, we've asked you to pray for people for the Harvest America. And because maybe there's somebody that you know that is hard or difficult, don't not pray for them just because it's hard. Because it's not about you, it's about God. And let God work in their life. All of us this morning experienced that wonderful time of year where we spring ahead. A couple weeks ago when we announced that, reminded that, some of the kids, some of the youth said, yay, and then later on they realized, oops, the clock goes the wrong way. And so thank you for being here this morning, because it is difficult when you don't get a good night's sleep and so forth. But the idea here is the lazy person, the sluggard, will use any excuse to avoid work. Maybe you have a coworker like that, a family member, that'll use any sort of an excuse they can to get out of stuff. May you and I not be like that. See, the slothful man is slothful because he imagines difficulties. He makes those difficulties more extreme. He makes them more dangerous than they really are. I'm not saying that there's not dangers in this world. There certainly are. But the lazy person, the slothful person, is one who makes anything much more difficult than it really is. So the lazy man or woman should be looking to the Lord Jesus Christ for victory over sin in their life. You see, in our spiritual lives, there are difficulties in our lives. Being a Christian is not easy. It's the best thing in this life. It's got eternal benefits, but it's not easy. And it's difficult sometimes, especially to overcome sin. Maybe it's unforgiveness. Maybe it's bitterness of heart. It's hard to overcome that. But may you not be that lazy person that says, well, it's just too hard. I've struggled with this all my life, and I'm just always going to struggle with it. No, God can bring you victory. Verse 4, the mouth of an immoral woman is a deep pit. He who is abhorred by the Lord will fall there. Again, we've looked at this, the immoral woman, the impure woman. This is the woman, and it's not just women, by the way. It's men and women. But the one who is just simply looking for a hookup, we might say. And they are a deep pit. You don't understand how quickly somebody can stumble and fall. And there's a number of ways that we can stumble and fall. But the idea is that when we fall, it is so great. And the wise or the prudent person avoids that. It's not that they have a hatred towards that person, but they avoid the pitfalls. And with that, you and I need to be that way. Continuing on in verse 15 with this idea of raising your child right, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from them. Now, sometimes this is a controversial verse. Does this mean that I beat my child because I beat all the sin out of them? Absolutely not. Discipline or physical discipline applied appropriately is appropriate. Not for the sake of causing anguish or pain or bruises and that sort of thing. But it's the idea that sometimes knowledge or discipline needs to be applied to the seat of knowledge. A paddle or something else like that. To discipline your child so for them to understand that you're serious about it. Now, discipline can take a number of forms and fashions. It could be the timeout, sit over here. It can be I'm taking away the electronics, but sometimes, and don't put it off the table, it's actual physical discipline. But not for the sake of damaging the child, not for the sake of causing bruises, and never as a parent in anger or frustration. And sometimes that's the greatest challenge for us as parents. We do get angry, we do get frustrated, but to take a pause back to be able to then discipline your child in an appropriate way and express again your love for that child. But understand this, children are not born as moral, neutral beings. In other words, they're not neutral. They are born sinners. And again, I already talked about this. All you got to do is go back to the toddler classroom, throw a bunch of toys in there, and watch the toddlers fight over them. They will. Nobody goes in there and says, okay, today we're going to fight over this. They just do. That's their nature. You say to little Johnny or little Sally, don't touch that, and they look at you and they do this. Why? Because they're rebellious by nature. And so you have to train them in the way of the Lord, and sometimes part of that training is, again, discipline, but appropriate discipline. You can't expect a 3-year-old to do a complicated task. You can't expect them to take out the trash every third Thursday or something else like that, but you might expect that of a teenager or something else. And so again, applying the discipline appropriately. You see, there is a moral problem in our culture. There's a moral problem with our children. And it's described as foolishness, and it comes into our hearts. Every child is born that way. I don't mean that your children are bad, but they need the discipline of the Lord, and the Lord has you as a parent to discipline them. You see, as a mother or a father, don't ever underestimate the difficulty of this task. It is hard. It is difficult to discipline your children because you, as the parent, have to be faithful. You can't say one day, no, don't do this, and the next day not say anything about it. You have to be consistent with it. Sometimes that means that you as a parent have to take your child away for a timeout, and you have to Put yourself in a timeout as well as you monitor them to make sure that they're doing what's appropriate. And so it is a real battle. And it's not for the faint of heart. It's not for somebody who's lazy. There's tremendous blessings with parenting your children correctly, but it is a challenge. It takes much prayer, much time and effort. And that's what we're all called to do. And this rod of discipline is not, again, to beat somebody. It's not to blister their bottom or anything else like that. But sometimes a physical discipline is appropriate for the particular child, depending on their age, depending on the infraction and everything else. You see, all of us have inherited the sin nature of Adam and Eve. Again, we like to call little children innocent. They're not really innocent. They just don't have the capacity to sin and lie as much. But as they grow, they do lie, they do sin, and that's our job as parents to, again, discipline them. And you see, if we don't discipline properly, we end up with all kinds of problems. You see here, the Bible gives us some examples of men who did not follow the instructions of the Lord. You might remember Eli. He was a temple priest, a godly man, but he didn't raise his sons well. He didn't discipline them appropriately, and his sons were literally stealing from the offering for their own personal gain. People would come into the temple to offer sacrifice to God, and Eli's sons were so corrupt that they were taking the money and the possessions that people meant to give to God for themselves. It's because Eli did not discipline his son. You might recall that David also. Again, David was a godly man. David was a man who was mightily used of the Lord. But he failed in disciplining and giving instruction to his own sons, to the point that his own son rebelled against him and tried to overthrow his kingdom. Why? Because his dad failed to discipline him and teach him in the ways of the Lord. And so you and I as parents, not only do we need to be godly examples, but then we need to follow through with discipline for our own children, that they might not depart from the ways of the Lord. Verse 16, he who oppresses the poor to increase in riches, and he who gives to the rich will surely come to poverty. For somebody who takes advantage of somebody who's poor, maybe they don't understand the language, or they don't understand this thing. Or maybe they don't have access to a lawyer. We find that commonly, that the poor man doesn't have access to high-quality legal advice. Yet if somebody's wealthy, they've got a string of lawyers. And sometimes those who are extremely wealthy will literally take advantage of the poor. May that not be our heart. May our heart not be that way. Even if you see the opportunity to take advantage of them, that you yourself wouldn't do that. Where people pay people less because they know that they don't have a leg to stand on. That's not right. That's not fair before the Lord. May you and I not be that way. May we not gain wealth simply by stealing or oppressing the poor. And if we do, understand this, God will be the final judge. Oh, they might get ahead in this life, but they won't get ahead for eternity. And God will be the final judge. Moving on here to verse 17. Now, verse 17 through the rest of this chapter is we've got a stylistic change. From chapter 10 to here, chapter 22, verse 16, has been a collection of one or two verses about different sporadic sort of topics that get repeated time and time again. But here, from verse 17 onward, is more larger themes as we go through this. So you'll notice some differences. So if you'll read along with me, verse 17 through 21. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise. Apply your heart to my knowledge. For it is a pleasant thing if you keep them within you. Let them all be fixed upon your lips, so that your trust may be in the Lord. I've instructed you today, even you, have I not written to you excellent things of counsels and knowledge, that I may make you know the certainty of the words of truth, that you may answer the words of truth to those who send you. Now, it's a sort of a long group of verses there, but you see this recurring theme, the value of the words of the wise, the value of heeding God's word. So incline your ear is a way to say, listen to what God has to say. We might say to children, are you listening to me? So incline is the idea of having an attitude of wanting to hear the words of the wise. And then notice this, it's not enough just to hear the words, but then apply your heart to this knowledge. Now remember, we talked about this in the book of Proverbs, that the fear or the respect, the honor for the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom and knowledge are synonymous. That it begins with a relationship with Jesus Christ. It begins with you and I saying, I can't fix myself. I can't get myself to heaven, and I need a Savior. That's where it begins. And so hearing the words is wonderful, but we need to walk in faith, or we need to apply those things. So it goes beyond just knowing the information or hearing the words, but it's actually applying it. You see, unless one's heart and mind are ready to receive the wisdom that God has for us, it'll be of no value to us. Did you catch that? Unless one's heart and mind are ready to receive wisdom, it's not going to do you any good. So that's why I'm asking you now to begin to pray for, before you ever have a conversation with your neighbor, your family member, your friend, to begin to pray for them, that God would soften their hearts, that they would come to this point of being able to receive Jesus Christ or be restored back to a right relationship with Christ. It begins with prayer, that their hearts would be soft and pliable in the hands of God. And if you find yourself struggling in any issue of your life, that you would begin to pray for yourself. Remember, it starts with prayer. Lord, give me a soft heart. Lord, give me a heart that's pliable in your hands. Because you and I don't have all the answers of life. And God will be faithful to do that. You see, the value of gaining and keeping wisdom is a pleasant life. I don't mean a pain-free life. I don't mean a life with what we might call the Midas touch. If you remember Midas, he was a Greek mythology that everything he touched turned to gold. That's not what we're talking about here. But we're talking about a pleasant life because you're no longer struggling with your God. Or you might have struggles in your life and difficulties. Matter of fact, Jesus did promise there would be difficulties in life. But the idea that you know that you have a right relationship with God. See, you see, the pathway of wisdom is difficult to walk on. It's easier to ignore God from a human perspective, but it's not the best. And we need to follow the Lord. You see, even the most brilliant moral sayings are powerless without personal application. The most eloquent speaker does you no good unless you're able to put it into practice. For those of you who are in school, or remember when you were in school, you may have had the brightest teacher in the world, but if you didn't do your homework, guess what? You didn't do well in the class. Maybe a coach was trying to help you to perform sports better, but if you didn't put it into practice, it didn't do you any good. You could go to the world-renowned musician to teach you something, how to play the trumpet as an example. But if you never practice, it's a waste of time and money. And so the idea is simply applied to wisdom as well. God's Word is filled with wisdom for us. And it's wonderful for us to study it, but we also need to apply it to our lives. May each of us do that. Moving on to verse 22 and 23. Do not rob the poor because he is poor. Do not oppress the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their cause. Plunder the soul of those who plunder them. You see, the poor amongst us deserve protection and compassion. That's what our legal system is built on. It doesn't always work perfectly, but the idea is that each of us, irregardless of our political connections or lack thereof, are supposed to have equal standing before the judge. That's the idea. That you and I would treat others with respect and dignity because they are created by God. That we would look beyond their skin color, their ethnicity, their heritage, their bank accounts, their education, and see them as somebody who God deeply loves. Now, maybe they're struggling. Maybe they're in bondage to some sin, and we'd be able to see the difference between this is their sin, but God loves their soul. That you'd begin to pray that God would rescue their soul. That the bondage that maybe they're in bondage to, that they would be set free from that they could walk with Jesus. But that's the idea. that you and I would defend, that we'd be willing to defend somebody who's less fortunate. Maybe they don't know the system. And that we would defend them, stand up for them. How somebody treats somebody who has less than them says a lot about that individual character. How you and I treat others that have less than us says a lot about our character. Oh, we never like it when somebody mistreats us. I understand that. But how do we treat others when we view ourselves as being better off than them? Maybe we have a better car, a better job, a better house. But how do you view others that have less than you? It reveals the character of your heart. Do you see them as individuals that God died for to rescue their souls? Or you just see them as somebody who's less fortunate? Again, the character of your own heart is revealed by how we think and view others that have less than us. Verse 24 and 25. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. Do not become the best friend is another way to put that. With somebody who's prone to anger. Somebody who can't control their anger. I'm not talking about somebody that gets upset at different things from time to time, but we all know people that you would classify their attitude as one that's just simply angry. They're always upset. It seems like it doesn't take but the smallest thing to set them off. And then they can't control their anger. They're prone to outburst of anger. That's a problem. And don't make that person the person that you hang out with. It displays bad character. Now, certainly, we all get upset about different things, but how do we control our anger? Does our anger literally control our lives? Then, if it is, then we become a dangerous companion to those around us. In wisdom, we would choose our friends or the people that we choose to invest our lives with carefully. That we would want people who would help us to be greater disciples in Jesus Christ. That we would avoid those that would drag us down. Now, we can reach out to them, but we're not engaged with them in the sense of a deep level of a friendship. Because we don't want to learn that person's way. Maybe somebody who's always yelling and cussing at every other driver, you want to be careful that you don't become that very same person. And then influence your own children by your own behavior. And so you need to be careful to guard yourself against that. You see, being friends to a hot-tempered person is like living in a house that's on fire. You never know what's going to set them off, and you never know how quickly or how much of that same sort of attitude that you would develop. And so again, we've talked about raising your children right, that you would be on guard with your own life, with your anger and your self-control, that you don't give your children a bad example. How does mom handle things when things go bad? How does dad handle things when things go bad? Your children are watching. I'm not suggesting that you never become angry, because I think we all get angry from time to time. But how do we handle it? Do we strike out at everyone else around us? Or we handle it more appropriately? Another phrase to put this is anger is madness. You ever been so angry that you can't think straight? It takes over your mind, and all you can think about is crushing something. That's what we're talking about. Don't let that be your character. Verses 26 and 27. Do not be one of those who shakes hands in a pledge, one of those who is surety for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should he make your bed or take your bed from underneath you? Surety of pledge, a handshake. Hey, I guarantee to pay the payments for this car. Surety is just being a co-signer or giving a loan to somebody. And here's the idea. I say, hey, I want to buy this. An example is a car, but I don't have enough credit. And so I go to you and I say, hey, would you be the co-signer on my loan for me? And you say, sure, you're a nice guy. I think I'll do that. But you don't have the finances, the resources to do that. And what happens when I default on the loan that you've co-signed on? Or crash the car and don't keep insurance on it or whatever else it might be? Guess what? Now you're on the hook. but now you didn't have the ability to pay. And so now you're on the hook for something that you didn't have the ability to pay, plus you don't get the car or whatever else it might be. And so he's saying, don't do that. Don't be foolish that way. If you have the financial resources to help somebody, wonderful. That's great. But don't go into debt yourself to try to help somebody else, because what will happen? The bank will come, take your house, take your car. In this specific example here, take your own bed from underneath you and kick you out of your house. Be careful how you handle your own money. I'm not saying that we can't be generous with others, but be careful that you don't make a pledge out of the desire to be looked upon by others as somebody who's really nice, but a pledge that you can't follow through with. Don't do that. Otherwise, you'll suffer the harm because of that. Verse 28, do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. Now, this doesn't always make sense to us in our modern vernacular, but understand this. In the ancient world, when Joshua entered the land, remember Israel, they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. Moses was the leader. Joshua took over. They crossed over the River Jordan. The first thing that happened was the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. They conquered the land, and then once they had relative peace, God had them divide all the land of Israel into family groups, into the 12 tribes. So every tribe, and then subdivided underneath that, every family, and then every family subdivided that everybody had a piece of land. It was an inheritance for the Jews, for the land. That's why they have such a strong value for the land there, even to this day. And so what they did when they originally divided up the land is they put stone markers in the fields to define the land. You know, we have this phrase today, good fences make for good neighbors, that sort of idea. And so, but generation after generation, the same stone would be there. At least that was the intention. And what would happen sometimes for those that wanted to take advantage of somebody else is they would just simply move that stone marker, maybe only a foot every year. Just move it a little bit. And after 20 years, they've taken over half of your property, or 2 or 3 generations from now, you have no more property. And that was the idea here. And it said, be a man, be a woman of integrity, not to move these ancient landmarks. Even if somebody else doesn't notice it, don't cheat them out of it. So that's the concept that he's talking about here. Sometimes crime, you ever notice this? Was easy or is easy to accomplish, but difficult to prove that somebody did it. And you want to be careful with that you and I don't succumb to that temptation to move those boundaries. Today in our vernacular, it's fences, or we have surveyors that go out, but you can hire another surveyor, or you can pay a judge, or do something else to try to take over somebody else's land. And you want to be careful with that. Now, if it's perfectly above reproach, above board, that's great to buy somebody's land or that sort of thing, but don't just sort of cheat on somebody else. That's the concept here. That's the idea. Verse 29. Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men. Notice this. A man who excels in his work. He himself may not be royalty. He may not be filthy rich, but his work speaks for himself. And his work is what gives him the audience of the king or the other wealthy individuals. You see, you and I as Christians, we are called to do everything that we do for the Lord. Colossians 3:23. And whatever you do, whether you're a street sweeper, toilet bowl cleaner, whatever you happen to be doing, do it heartily or with all of your heart as to the Lord, not to men. You see, it's easy if we get paid enough and if the boss is around to do a good job. Anybody can do that. But you and I, as Christians, we're to do our best, because even though we're cleaning toilets, we're doing our best for Jesus. We're cleaning that toilet for Jesus. Now, maybe the company's giving you a paycheck because you clean their toilets, which is wonderful. But remember, your work is not just to please men, but it's really to be done unto the Lord. And so that's the concept here. May your work be such that others want you to be there to work. May you be a man or woman of integrity. May you put forth your best effort in everything, that you not be the lazy or the slothful person. And your work, when you excel at it, is what gives you the audience of the king or the president of the company. Because others will notice that you're working well before the Lord. And we see that Jesus taught the same sort of principle throughout the Gospels. In Matthew 25, Luke 19, and John 12, it says essentially the same sort of thing. He taught us that one who is trustworthy in the smallest things or the smallest matters of this world will be entrusted with 10 cities in his coming kingdom. The idea is, you might say, but I'm just a toilet cleaner. I don't know why I use that example, but we'll just go with it. I'm just a toilet cleaner. What good am I to God? And God says, no, you're good. If you're cleaning toilets for me, that's wonderful. And there will be a reward. Be faithful, be diligent in what you and I might think are the small things. Let me plug this one more time. Be diligent over the next several months to pray for the harvest. Pray for your friends. Pray for that family member who's been deeply hurt by some event in their life. Pray for that family member that wants to have nothing to do with you. Pray for a softening of their heart. Maybe you don't get the joy of seeing their life being restored, but understand this, God can still do it. God might use somebody else in the life to bring restoration. One of my sisters, I remember many years ago, she came to visit, and she was in kind of a crisis in her lifetime, and my wife and I both were sharing with her the need to surrender to Christ. She'd grown up in the church, but the phrase that she used at that time is, I know about Jesus, but I don't know him the way you and Sherry do. Because she wasn't a Christian at that time. And I prayed for her. And honestly, she never came to me and said, hey, I surrendered my life to the Lord. Except for several years later, she moved to a different part of the country, and the Lord, through another church, brought her into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. I didn't have anything to do with it, except I prayed for her. And when she did surrender her heart to the Lord, I could rejoice with her of what the Lord is doing. So I'm saying to you, maybe you have a friend, a co-worker, a neighbor, somebody that lives in another part of the world or right next door, but pray for them and ask the Lord to intervene in their lives, to touch their lives. Be faithful in the small thing. You might think praying is something small, but in God's economy, praying is huge. It's big. Jesus prayed. If Jesus spent time praying, we find him frequently in the Gospels as he was ministering to crowds of people. What he did? He withdrew from the crowds to get alone to be with his Father, to commune or to pray with his Father. The disciples, the apostles, taught us to pray. They frequently got together and prayed. We have some of those prayers recorded for us. The idea that prayer is not a small thing before God. It's huge. Pray for yourself. Pray for, again, those people that you know that are hurting, that don't have a relationship with God, or that have wandered away from the Lord. Pray for them and see what God will do. Be faithful in those small things, and God will get you, when we spend eternity with him, or especially during what we call the millennial reign of Christ, God will give us responsibility over different areas. And it's because you're faithful in those little things, maybe cleaning toilets, maybe faithfully praying for others, that God will have you have more responsibility.